Welcome to the Happy Mindset, episode 137. Today's episode is the first episode of the year, and it's called Organised Creativity. So this is a theme that I want to explore more this year. It's been something that I've been exploring anyway for the last few years, and it manifests in my draw to computer programming, my draw to writing, my draw to speaking. So to speaking, I would say speaking is probably the most fluid and most creative part of what I do. Writing is quite creative as well, but I do have more time to think through writing, so I got more time to structure and organize my thoughts. So when I wrote my book there, for example, you have a big chunk of time, nobody's rushing me. I don't have to do it up impromptu in the moment, I don't have to speak. So I really get the time to think through things in a logical sequence, and I get to think about how is this going to be perceived by somebody as well before I even publish it. I guess for my book, I had Lisa Caprilli, who helped me to publish my first book, and that helped a lot because that was like a sounding board. So I wasn't in my own little echo chamber just writing away about a story that I thought people would relate to. A lot of the feedback was actually coming from Lisa, that whether something resonated with her, landed with her, it was still my story. I was still coming up with stuff myself. But by having somebody else with the writing, and also by having a large chunk of time, I think it took me 6 months initially to write the book. Then I went through a period of Davey was doing the illustrations for the book. And then I think I wrote the first chapter after that period. Because like I've mentioned before, the first chapter was actually the hardest part for me to write. Because that's where it all began. And that's where the majority of the darkness to the book was. The shadow sides and the darkness. Well, in fairness, it was a very traumatic experience. So I wouldn't speak of it lightly. And I wanted to do it justice. So I got to a good place in my mind at the end, and I went back and did the first chapter again after that. So it made more sense. So with Organised Creativity, I think the biggest obstacle I've encountered so far with creativity for a large chunk of my life has been the line that you're walking where if you become too creative, so creativity, you're somebody who thinks outside the box. But if you venture too far outside the box, into outer space where you're so far removed from the box that people don't get what you're on about anymore. That's the line you're drawing there, and that's a very difficult line psychologically, I feel, anyway, to deal with until you start being grounded in yourself. This is why the internal world is so important, to get grounded in yourself. That's why breath work, meditation, more looking at life through more of a spiritual lens. I don't get lost down that rabbit hole either, to be honest. I'm more of a practical person. But without grounding, breath work, some sort of understanding spiritually, it'd be very, very difficult to navigate this line. Because, like I said, if you venture too far outside the box into outer space, you can feel a lot of disconnection and isolation, and that can lead to feelings of there's something wrong with you and how you're looking at the world. So that's something to navigate, especially when you're around people who aren't thinking in a similar fashion to you, who haven't allowed their mind to wander that far. So that's something to balance, and that's why I'm talking about organized creativity, because what I found that's helped is to have an organization to my thinking, which I get through writing and which I get through programming as well. Programming is a very step-by-step, logical sequence of thinking to solve real-world problems. So that keeps you grounded, thinking about things that are real. Because with creativity, there is an element where you can get too much into the abstract that you're not fully in reality. You're not looking at real problems. You're not looking at real life. You can't connect in a real way with people because you're not in that realm. So that's the balancing act there. I guess when the podcast, another thing that it gives me is the opportunity to speak to other people. This is another way of grounding yourself, is by taking on other perspectives. So you can see a wide range of perspectives. So you're not just focused on your own out-of-the-box thinking. There is that connection to reality then when you've got other perspectives, taking on board that also gives you an insight into the fact that everybody's got problems. A lot of the time we don't talk about our real problems, though sometimes you can get the feeling that maybe I'm the only one with real problems. But by me having a podcast where I talk to real people in a real way, I get some insights into like what are the real challenges they're facing and how are they really overcoming them in their lives. So then that gives me more of a freedom then to be real with myself and say, this is what I'm going through. And this is, I guess, what helps too, is that I can be more honest in my books because I know it's not just me going through this. So I can talk about more personal stuff that I wouldn't maybe be able to talk about if I didn't have that perspective that I'm not the only one going through this stuff. Because keeping up appearances is a real thing, and it's hard to move beyond that if you haven't got conversations going with people who are giving you an insight into what's the reality of their life, rather than the keeping up appearances, superficial surface appearances. So with the programming and the writing, that gives me that organization to my thinking. It helps me to refine things more, so I'm not too diffuse in my thinking, so that I can slow down and try and connect ideas together better. I'm also accepting that there's going to be a bit of fluidity to it too. I'm not going to get this perfect, because if you're trying to express something that somebody else hasn't expressed for you before, there is going to be a bit of messiness to it. It's like, the analogy I would draw is when you're programming, when you're a self-taught programmer, you're going to focus on building real world projects. And at the beginning, and even as you progress, what you'll find is that you'll learn through trial and error. You'll learn through making a lot of mistakes and actually understanding the errors. When programming, a large chunk of the process is just understanding what the error is saying to you. And also, when you read an error, one of the most overwhelming things you're going to meet as a programmer is when you get your first errors and you see all the lines of code in that error. You see all the lines there in the error code. But over time, you realize, you start to pinpoint where in that huge chunk of text is the error you need to get started to solve the issue. So it's similar with creativity. Like I talked to Seth Godin last year. He talked about bending things too far and not bending it enough. I think he said you're a hack if you don't bend it enough. And if you bend it too far, then people lose you. They just ignore you. So you're looking to find that balance. And like he said, you find that through experience, through practice, through implementation. What I find is through groundedness. When you get to a stage also where you're not looking for validation, for people to like you and like your work. And that, I have found, you get that through experience, through consistently doing the work. Regardless of the outcome, you start realizing who you're doing it for more on an internal emotional level. You start to realize that. So another thing I want to move on to here is, so I've talked a little bit about organization of thought. I'll talk a little bit actually about original ideas. There's conflicting opinions about this. A lot of people will say, and I would agree, that there's no real thing now as like an original thought. No such thing as an original thought. I'd agree to an extent. I don't know whether that's 100% true, but I think it's largely true that most of the ideas have already been thought of. Most of the thoughts have already been thought of by somebody through time. Even today, when you come up with an original thought, a good chance that somebody else is thinking about it today as well, in some other end of the world or some other place. What I would believe, though, is that original thinking comes from combining our existing ideas and thoughts in your own original, unique way, because you're looking at it through the filter of your experience of life and what you've gone through, and the things you've solved already, and just the things you're thinking about, because we're not all thinking about the same thing all the time. So there'd be the variations there that would go into the original thought. But so that was a little tangent there about the original thought. I just wanted to put that in there quickly. So what I was moving on to do was the distance between your thoughts. I talked a little bit about organization of thought, so that it's increasing the chances that you're coherent, so you can actually connect with people. Because if you're not coherent and people can't understand your diffuse way of thinking, they'll get bored of it. They'll get tired of it because they've real problems in their life. They've real life to deal with, and if you're not making any sense to them, you're not going to have impact in their life. Your stuff won't stick with them, won't land with them. It won't be helpful. At the end of the day, the stuff you're creating needs to be helpful in some way. So the distance, that was the organization. The distance with your thoughts, though, is another key thing as a creative person, because this gives you the space you need to laugh at yourself, and it gives you the space you need to take a step back from your thinking, because your thinking is going to get stuck, and it's going to get like the computer programming. You're going to run into errors where you're stuck. You've gone down a rabbit hole of thinking, and you realize that this isn't going any further now. This isn't making any progress. There's some error here. What is the error? Like in programming, you have to take the time to look at the error and then adjust your course. So the distance you need there with the thoughts, you can't As a creative person, I'm not going to say you can't. It's not a rule or whatever. But what I found is very helpful is when you've got that space between your thoughts where you're not identifying with a solution. So when you do run into an error, you've no problem emotionally going back, tracking back and going, where did I go wrong here? How do I adjust my course? So you're becoming more like a river where you're just, whenever you're encountering an obstacle, you're just moving around it. You're readjusting your course rather than trying to bulldoze your way through something that's not moving. So the distance, like I mentioned in a lot of episodes already, you'll get that through practices like meditation, through breath work, anything that will get you connected to your breath, get you in your body so that you've got a space between your head, your thoughts, your breath. Breath is really important. I've seen that mentioned before, even monks. Don't know what part of the world it was, but I heard before that the younger ones, anyway, when they're being educated, that was one of the first things that they be taught is the breath. How that is the one constant you have all throughout life. It's your breathing, it's your breath. You stop breathing, you're not no longer living here. So that just shows how important that is. That's the one constant that you have in life. So it's important to work with that and to just work with that, be aware of that. Because I do feel like the breath work in my life has led to more self-awareness than I otherwise would have, because without the breath work, I would identify with my thoughts in my head and the image of who I am. And it wouldn't be something that's more fluid, so I could evolve and change as a person. So the last thing I want to talk about, it ties into the last previous two things I was talking about, with the organized thinking, being intentional about that, wanting to increase your ability to organize your thoughts, be more rational about things, the distance between your thoughts, being aware of who you are, connecting with your breath. This leads into another problem you could encounter otherwise as a creative person. And you'll see it with, I think it's like postmodernists, where they can go down like a rabbit hole of taking ideas to an extreme. Because I think one of the things they do, and actually something that I do, is question fundamental things about life. Fundamental stuff like how we expect girls and boys to behave and all that kind of realm. What I see postmodernists kind of thinking take it to the extreme, where they start questioning biological stuff, which I don't think is a great approach to go down. So that ties back to the reason I don't go down there is because I'm not identifying with the thoughts. So I'm not looking to convince anybody of anything. I don't really care what people believe. What I do care about, though, is like, what's reality? What's biology? What are these basic facts about life that aren't up for debate? And then also seeing what is up for debate, what clearly is up for debate, and what isn't up for debate. So that ties back to the organized thinking, just being rational about things. Biologically, we can see that there are differences between boys and girls and stuff. But then you can also, at the same time, the same person can look at, why do we expect boys to act like this? Why do we expect girls to act like this? And then also not imposing my way of being in the world either. Like, if I see that boys are wearing blue and girls are wearing pink, that's a fascinating one, because I think it used to be the opposite way around at some point in time, where boys were wearing pink and girls were wearing blue. I don't know what the period of time was, but I definitely remember reading at one stage where it changed when marketing and advertising came into existence, where it was the images and the portrayal of life just switched. So that's the power of a narrative. That's the power of the thought. And like, that's the side of stuff that we can start questioning on an individual level for ourselves without imposing that on anybody else. Not saying. So I think that's another trap that you can fall into when you haven't got, this ties into the distance with your thinking, that you're sifting through all this stuff that you can easily go through life assuming all this stuff is true because that's your feedback from the environment, but you can actually also go down a hole, not a hole. You can also instead question it for yourself at an individual level without imposing it on anybody else. So nobody necessarily even knows what you believe about this stuff, because you're not imposing your will on anybody else. What you're doing, though, is curiously questioning this stuff, so you've got more freedom in your world. And you're also just, I guess what I do through my podcast, I express this stuff, so somebody who's that way inclined, they want to have more freedom in their life, They don't want to go around like a dictator imposing their will on anybody else, but they want to understand how to go about questioning this stuff in a healthy and curious way. That's what I do through this podcast. I just share these thoughts, share these ways of how I'm thinking about things that give me so much more freedom psychologically in my mind. And like I said, if I didn't have a podcast, if I didn't write, I don't think anybody would notice about me, because it's not something I go around imposing my will around. It's just ways of thinking, ways of framing things. I guess it's because I question the most basic assumptions about life, and because of my organized thinking, I can also, and my breath work, those two things, the organization of my thinking and the distance between the thoughts, I can still live in a grounded way in the real world. And when I do fall out of balance, I know where the center is, that because I know myself. And through this process, it's just, as you go through the experience, the more you seek, the less you seek validation externally on an emotional level for the work you do and the way you think about things, just more grounded you become. That's been the biggest obstacle for me over the years. It's been that constantly seeking validation, constantly seeking, am I doing the right thing? And that leads to a lack of confidence. It's a vicious cycle, because that leads to a lack of confidence. A lack of confidence means people won't listen to you, they won't follow you. Not that you're looking for followers or anything. It's more, I guess, as a creative person, it means a lot when you do put stuff out there and you see that it's helping. And like I said, I haven't got a specific way of thinking. I've just got a way of looking at the world that I found really helpful, because I did used to live in the quote unquote normal way of being, where I just accepted everything my environment was telling me, and that was not a life well lived. So yeah, they're the main things I wanted to just share today for the first episode of this year, Organised Creativity. I want to explore this more this year in my writing and on my podcast, interviewing people. And it's just really just questioning stuff in a healthy way, remaining grounded in reality. I guess, that's another phrase that I always kind of hated growing up, be realistic. Because the people who used to kind of say that, or just even have that sentiment, they have that tone to their voice when they interacted with you, that was more coming from a place of their limitations, putting them on you. So just finding the line, we're balancing the line here. Understanding tone, intonation, all this kind of stuff, understanding the differences. Because I think you do need to be grounded in reality to have a real world impact and to touch people. But you have to also, I suppose this is something that I'm constantly evolving with, it's discernment. It's discerning the person who's saying be realistic because they've given up on life and they're dead inside, and the person who's saying be realistic because they see that you need a bit more grounding. And also even discerning as well, this is why life is so complex, discerning whether this person is projecting their own inadequacies and their own stuff onto you. And again, that'll all come back to the breath work, knowing yourself and knowing like how you feel about things. So we're going to explore all this stuff this year. It's all to do with self-education, knowing yourself. Like for me, self-education is about knowing yourself and then developing the practical skills that you're drawn to, developing the creativity, voicing your thoughts, voicing your opinions. It's all personal development because it's very highly charged. There's so many insecurities you can have about voicing your opinions, voicing your thoughts, even putting in the time and discipline to think out your thoughts, define them by writing, by whatever outlet you're finding. But they're the main things I want to cover this year. As always, if you want to check out my work, head over to happymindset.com. You'll find the book and my writing there and the podcast. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you on the next episode.